I've been a long-standing member of the Gallipoli Association for, I suppose, 25 years or so, and I visited Gallipoli with the association a number of years ago now. So it's always held a particular fascination for me, which might seem unusual being from Ireland, but Gallipoli would have had a significant resonance in Ireland. The Somme is probably better known, more commemorated, but Gallipoli is in the background as well. So hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll have a sense of where I'm coming from with that. And I'm going to focus my talk on the Royal Munster Fusiliers, which would be the local regiment to me here. So some of this is coming from a book I published a few years ago called The Kingdom in the Empire. The title, The Kingdom, that's the kind of colloquial name for County Kerry, where I'm from. So the title was The Kingdom, County Kerry within the British Empire. That was the title, and it was based on the First World War and does include Gallipoli as well. So that was just by way of reference on where I got some of my source material. So I suppose just to do a little bit of a quick run around and look at it from the strategic level and then bring it down to a local level. So the war, why did it start? We're all well aware of that, but again, it's I suppose just to show how everything can be localized and all history ultimately is local. We're seeing that at the moment. A war in Ukraine against Russia has had consequences for countries, far, far away from it, including the UK and Ireland. As we know, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. That's well known. There's nothing new on that. And then how did that lead to a war? So there was a complicated series of alliances that ultimately pitted Russia, France, and Britain against Germany. So that's in a very broad stroke. Um, the reason the war kind of it's often said that Europe and the world fell into the war, that while it might have been preordained to an extent, a lot of the things that happened were driven by train timetables. So, in other words, if you were looking to put troops on the ground for a pitched battle, which is what it was expected to be, trenches hadn't been considered. You needed to get your armies to the battle zone as quickly as possible, and train timetables were a key driver. And it took a long time for armies to get organized, and that was the same in every country. Some were better than others. The Germans had been predicting war for many years. They had built railway platforms across from their military barracks in many cases, which meant the troops just simply went out the gate and they were ready to go. So they were better prepared than others. All of this was happening, and Ireland was quite blissfully unaware of it to a large extent at the time, and it wasn't of great consequence. However, when Britain declared war to honour their obligations to Belgium, that included the British Empire, which of course included Ireland as well. So that's how Ireland became involved in the war. But on the lead up to it, and if you study local newspapers, the war was in the Balkans, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It wasn't being seen or wasn't being mooted as a particular threat, and the declaration of war, was quite a shock to many people in Ireland, I'd say. And again, they would have been driven by the same sense of excitement that would have been seen in other parts of the British Empire at the time. And a global event would have local implications, and I suppose I'd always make the point that all history is ultimately local, and that's where my interest comes from. My own particular interest is how does a global event have local implications? So the battle itself, again, I'm chatting a lot to the converted here, but I'm just trying to set the scene, I suppose, for the Irish involvement in this. Gallipoli or Gelibolu is a town on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. It's more accurate to refer to it as the Dardanelles campaign. And when I was growing up as a young boy many years ago now, and there were still some veterans around or relations of people who had fought from in Gallipoli from this area, they would always refer to it as the Dardanelles. Gallipoli wouldn't enter their lexicon. So even within Ireland, older people would have generally referred to it as the Dardanelles. So that would be where that comes from. By 1915, as you know, there was a rigid stalemate on the western and eastern fronts, and supplies were running out on the eastern front. Obviously, the Russians were under significant pressure. Winston Churchill, as you know, wanted to use Britain's sea dominance to force a naval assault, and the Dardanelles had been blockaded since 1914. So the most powerful navy in the world was in many ways sidelined from the main event, which was a land war in Europe. And this was, I suppose, an attempt, if you like, to bring that into play and make use of it from a strategic perspective. He proposed to force the straits leading to Constantinople, what we know today as Istanbul, force peace terms and knock Turkey out of the war. That was the original plan, and would also open a supply route to Russia. Again, the Turks had sided with Germany, although Britain had been making overtures. And I suppose it's one of the great lessons of history, or one of the great imponderables of history. What would have happened, or how might the world have been changed if Britain had, for example, sided with the Turks, or the Turks had sided with Britain and didn't take the Germans' part in the war? Would it have had a different outcome? It probably would. It would certainly have avoided the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli campaign. The plan was bold and audacious. Two key things you're looking for in a military strategy is something that's bold and audacious. You want to try and surprise the enemy, but it was also quite risky, which is something you would always try and mitigate against. And I suppose the question you'd have to ask, and I suppose the question I've asked myself many times, was it likely that the Ottoman Empire, as poor and all as it was, and as disintegrating as it was, would it crumble at the appearance of a few warships off its capital? Um, and I would wonder, was it a realistic proposition? Of course, there would have been panic. Of course, there would have been a reaction. But was it entirely likely that the empire would crumble? I'm not convinced it would have. There would have been a reaction, of course, but I'm not convinced that would have made the huge difference that was expected. The reward for success was enticing, and there was a lot of romance about the proposal as well. Obviously, the link to Troy and the Trojan Wars was there in the background as well. So the idea of the Gallipoli campaign, the invasion, the seaborne assault with naval ships, it was quite enticing. And even Rupert Brooke, the famous poet, who would be known in Ireland as well, on his headstone it says, "In deliverance of Constantinople from the Turks," going back, I suppose, to the Crusades in earlier times. So for those reasons, the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles, it had a lot of romance about it. It had a lot of, I suppose, drama, subplots in it, but it was at the same time, I suppose, a risky enough venture, looking at it with the benefit of hindsight. So to probably help ourselves understand it a bit better and set the scene for what I'm about to talk about, I suppose I'm just going to talk about the three main drivers of it all. So the first item to consider was the objective itself. So what was hopefully going to be achieved? So the objective was to force the Narrows, and I'll talk more about the Narrows in a moment, and sail to Constantinople. That was the objective. That was the key objective. The expected outcome. So what were the military hoping to do? They were hoping that the presence of the fleet would cause panic, knock Turkey out of the war, and open the sea route to Russia. By the time the ships would have sailed through the Narrows, through the Dardanelles, and arrived off the coast of Constantinople, Istanbul, they would have opened the sea lane leading into the Black Sea and on into Russia. That was the hope, and it was the hope that the Turks would actually collapse and wouldn't be able to put up a resistance to it. The resources committed, what was being put into it? Well, this I think was the significant issue. As such, aged ships will suffice, and no troops are required, as the landing will not be affected, and no ground will need to be taken or held. So I mean, the whole idea here was that ships on their own would do the job, and as such, as the ships weren't expected to be engaging in any kind of a battle, they didn't need to be top quality. They didn't need to be modern warships. So they were kind of second class ships, if you like, if you want to put it in that extent. Now they were perfectly good enough for what was proposed, but there was absolutely no commitment to ground forces. And I suppose in a modern context, we're seeing this again today. We're seeing this notion that you don't need to put troops on the ground to dominate territory, and we're seeing the in the Ukraine war with Russia, we're seeing a huge proliferation of drone technology. This notion that you don't need to have troops in position, you can still dominate the territory. And I suppose if you look back at Gallipoli, there's a lesson to be learned there as well. That this is an attempt at that stage to try and do something similar. To not need to try and do it, I suppose, as easily and as efficiently as possible without necessarily committing troops, which of course bring a logistical issue with them. So that was from a strategic, I suppose, high level overview. That's what was expected. That was what was intended. So where is the Irish involvement in all of this? So there's the naval assault. There were numbers of people in Irish people who were in the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was traditionally seen as a legitimate employer. People from West Kerry, you'd have heard of Tom Crean, the explorer. People from West Kerry would traditionally have joined the Royal Navy. It would have been seen as a legitimate career option for many of them, and they would have joined the Royal Navy and served in the Royal Navy. So the naval assault itself, as we've discussed, there was very little intelligence available, very little information. So there was a certain amount of doing this on the blind. The Dardanelles itself, how well protected was it? Well, it was defended by forts, which were quite aged in and of themselves. There were rows of minefields across the straits. There were 177 guns of different calibers, mainly supplied by Krupp. I'll show you an example in a moment. So there was quite a defence, but of course it was totally predicated on stopping the assault going beyond its narrowest point, and I'll show you that in a moment. It also included large coastal defence guns, howitzers, which of course could be moved, field guns, dismounted ships guns, and mortars. The British Admiralty themselves had conducted a study in 1906, what we might call today a war gaming, and they concluded that a joint operation, which would involve troops, would be needed to force the straits. So you have to ask yourself the question, what had changed between 1906 and 1915 that would have led the planners to come to the conclusion that ships alone would have been enough? French and British battleships that were provided were old, but they were good enough, and they began the campaign on the 17th of February 1915. And this was the big thing. There was no troop commitment, as I touched on already. The belief was that the sight of ships appearing at Constantinople would cause collapse. Everything was based on that. It was based on the notion that the the ships would sail relatively unmolested through the Narrows, that it wouldn't be an issue for them, that they would sail all the way to Constantinople, and that in of itself, that feat would have been enough to cause the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Um, I'd have to say myself, it's not a plausible theory. Militarily, to dominate territory, you must put boots on the ground. Certainly in 1915, maybe not so much today, but certainly back then. How could you change the culture or a country or even the government if you didn't have people in there committed to it? So I suppose that's the great imponderable. And this would have been debated in Ireland for months and months after the campaign. The failure of the campaign, or the fact it didn't achieve its success. If you read a lot of the articles from Middle Ireland, if you want to call it that, that was the big discussion point by them, was, why didn't they commit troops from the very beginning? Why did it happen as it happened? The naval assault certainly did cause panic, and it had a degree of success. People began to evacuate from Constantinople, but not to the extent that was hoped. However, the real issue, of course, was Turkish mines on the Narrows sank a number of battleships, and both navies were not prepared to continue. So the initial plan, which was to force the Straits, sail to Istanbul, now wasn't a runner, so they had to rethink things. It was decided the troops would have to be committed, but of course they were not immediately available. So this is the real, I suppose, disappointment with Gallipoli and the planning of it, and I'm sure all of you as historians are well aware of this. The initial attempt to force them by naval ships alone wasn't a success. As a consequence, then it was decided troops had to be committed, and it had to be done in a big hurry, and of course, it hadn't been planned for. That's a picture of myself a few years ago on one of the dismounted naval guns defending the Narrows, just to give you a sense of scale and what it is that we're dealing with. So that's quite a large gun over a relatively small area. This is an aerial photograph, satellite imagery of the Narrows themselves. So you can see there on the left-hand side, they're 2.5 miles wide at their narrowest point. And to give you a sense of scale, on the right-hand side, that's a container ship where the little yellow arrow is. So they're quite narrow. They're well named. They're not that hard to dominate militarily. That's a picture I took myself there a good few years ago, and it just gives you a sense, I suppose, it was taken from that gun I was standing on. It gives you a sense, I suppose, of how near the other part of the peninsula was. So from that perspective, Easy for me to say this now, looking at it at this distance, but there wasn't that kind of information available to the planners at the time, and you could understand, I suppose, to an extent, why they felt the naval ships in of themselves might be enough to do the job. So again, just to reiterate why the troops were committed, the wavy line there is roughly the route taken by the ships, the naval ships. They encountered mines and the Bouvet, the Irresistible, and the Ocean sunk, and there were three other ships damaged with mines. Just before they got to the actual narrow points that I was showing you there a moment ago. And that in of itself was probably the end of the naval attempt to force the Narrows to Constantinople, Istanbul, which was 150 miles away. So there was a lot of territory to navigate before you got beyond this point. So before they really got into it, I suppose, the plan had started to unravel, and that was the requirement to put troops into the mix. So, after the failure of the naval attacks, ground forces were assembled, and this was done in a real hurry. It hadn't been considered, hadn't been planned, wasn't expected to happen. The troops that were earmarked or ended up in Gallipoli were earmarked for other places, primarily the Western Front. The hastily prepared plan was for the troops to neutralize Turkish artillery so that minesweepers could clear the straits for the battleships. So the whole idea here was that the troops would land, they would neutralize the Turkish artillery primarily at the forts that I mentioned earlier, and that they would free up the minesweepers, the naval minesweepers, who could then go ahead, clear the mines, and allow the battleships to continue. So it was a variation of the original plan. The main thrust, the main effort was still going to be a naval attempt to force the Straits. Ian Hamilton, General Sir Ian Hamilton, who was a well-known military hero, a Victoria Cross winner, he was given 78,000 troops, called the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, but very little time to prepare. 78,000 troops sounds like an awful lot of troops. It's probably the size of the British Army today. Wouldn't be far off that figure. That's a lot of troops. Now, of course, they were of varying quality and they were of varying experience, but it seems like a lot of people. But again, they wouldn't have been used to working together. But again, the belief was this will be a relatively quick action. Land the troops, they'll do what they need to do, and it won't be a big issue. The staff are hugely important in any military campaign. The staff officers, particularly the senior staff officers who actually make the decisions. And they didn't have maps of the area, certainly nothing of any great consequence, to the extent that the staff officers for Hamilton went out and bought atlases from newsagents and bookshops. So that was the rush nature of this, and the detail, I suppose, and how quickly it was all put together. Logistics were a nightmare. Supply lines were stretching for up to 1,000 miles. And again, even today, logistics will win you a battle. So there's an expression, it talks about no logs, no war. In other words, if you don't have the logistics right, you're not going to win the battle. And again, this is another lesson learned, I suppose, from Gallipoli, that the logistical side of it, particularly things like fresh water, food, evacuation of wounded, were an absolute nightmare. The terrain was unknown. That was another thing. It's not like today where you could do a survey, do an aerial reconnaissance. There was none of this available. You're relying on atlases and local knowledge, or incomplete knowledge. And the terrain that they were going to be expected to fight through was unknown to them, and it was much more difficult to traverse than actually believed. The other side, of course, there was a level of overconfidence on the Allied side. They didn't particularly rate the Turkish soldier. They believed that their own troops, particularly the professional troops, the pre-war troops, would have been of a high quality and would be able to deal with whatever the Turk threw at them. An example of that, and I've used this before, they just to show you the level of overconfidence. There was a circular issued, as we might call it, and it says Turkish soldiers, as a rule, manifest their desire to surrender by holding their rifle butt upward and by waving rags or clothes of any colour. An actual white flag should be regarded with the utmost suspicion, as a Turkish soldier is unlikely to possess anything of that colour. So there's a few bits in that. There's a suggestion that they wouldn't have anything clean, but there's also a suggestion that maybe if you do see a white flag, you possibly need to ignore it. But it's not an illustration of this is a very competent enemy that we need to be fearful of. It's entirely the opposite. It's showing a level of confidence, and I would suggest maybe overconfidence. Security was another issue for the Allied side. It was quite lax. The 60,000 Turkish troops knew that a landing was coming. So we've 78,000 from Ian Hamilton's side, the Allied side. We've 60,000 Turkish troops. The issue for the Turks is they don't know where the landing is going to be. However, there are still 60,000 people. Uh, Modern thinking would be that if you're having a seaborne landing, if you're invading a defended area by sea, you're looking at odds something like 10 to 1 in your favour. So going by that, Hamilton should have had 600,000 troops. So again, even though the figures appeared matched, the advantage is always with the defender. They've always got time to defend, much harder to attack. And the hardest invasion of all is coming in from the sea. So the security was lax, and I mentioned the ratio of for a seaborne landing of 10 to 1. Um, the Turks themselves, they were lacking, I suppose, from the staffing perspective, and they had German officers who came probably to a large extent began to dominate the thinking, I suppose, and the mindset and the preparations. And more importantly, they had 6 precious weeks to prepare defences. So in 6 weeks, they were never going to be able to defend every possible location, but they were certainly able to defend quite a lot of them, and they were able to prepare themselves to a large extent. And that was going to have significant consequences for the Royal Munster Fusiliers in particular, and I'll show you that there in a moment. Uh, and again, I suppose what's also forgotten in all of this, and I suppose the idea that the Turk wasn't going to fight to any great extent. Um, the Turks themselves were Muslims, of course they were. They were defending their homeland against a Christian army. Now we can debate that it was part of a greater scheme, and it was an attempt to force the Straits and I suppose take some pressure off of Russia in the war. But of course, the Turks were always going to fight tenaciously. They were defending their homeland against a Christian army. To them, it was another iteration of a crusade, and I think that's sometimes forgotten in the discussions around Gallipoli and around the Dardanelles that. The Turk fought tenaciously. He fought very well. Maybe not as well trained, maybe not as well armed, or not as well disciplined, or on all of those issues. But to his mind, he was defending his home. So naturally enough, he was going to fight tenaciously. So again, the military intelligence side hadn't really picked up on this and hadn't really considered it. So I suppose all the ingredients were there for a lot to go wrong. And there's the expectation that it would all go in a particular way, I think was flawed from the start. So to bring it back to a local context from my perspective, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, they are the RMF, and I heard Mick mention he had a connection. I think a member of his family were involved. So nice to hear that. And so the Royal Munster Fusiliers, their depot is about 10 miles from where I'm sitting at the moment, in Tralee, the next town over. Uh, the British Army would have heavily relied on Irishmen joining, as they did in other parts of the empire. But the British Army had about 58,000 men of Irish origin in the army at the outbreak of the war. The British Army was a legitimate employer. They actively recruited in Ireland, and Irishmen joined the British Army for many years. It was quite common for generations of fathers and sons to join, brothers to join together for various reasons. It was adventure, it was excitement. There was maybe a degree of patriotism for some people. For a lot of the rank and file, though, it was an opportunity. It was a career opportunity. It gave employment, regular employment. It also, of course, I suppose, presented them with an opportunity to travel, adventure, and of course, the opportunity for a pension. All of that was very attractive, certainly to the poorer people in Ireland. The proportion of Catholics to Protestants who joined the British Army was roughly equal, but for very different reasons. The British Protestant, for example, most likely coming from the northern part of Ireland, where the bulk of Protestants would be, but they were throughout the rest of Ireland as well. A lot of those would have more patriotic reasons to join. Whereas the Catholics, by and large, wouldn't have been thinking in that light. For a lot of them, it was financial, economic reasons that would propel them into the army, or simply following a familial connection and joining for those reasons. The Royal Munster Fusiliers themselves were formed in 1881. So I suppose it's important to understand when Irish people joined the British Army, they didn't always necessarily join their local regiment. So, for example, you could have the Scots Guards could be stationed in a town in Ireland for a year, 2 years. That would be quite common. And local young boys there, young men, would join the Scots Guards purely because they were the local regiment. And then they might move on and they might be replaced by the Northumberland Fusiliers, for example, and the young men might join that regiment. So that's why you see Irishmen cropping up all over the place, joining different regiments. However, if you were in the geographical area of the Munster Fusiliers, certainly post the Haldane reforms and into 1881 and thereafter, the likelihood was that you would join your local regiment, the Royal Munster Fusiliers. The regimental depot was at Ballymullen Barracks, Tralee. That's still a military barracks, still used by the Irish Defence Forces. Not to the same extent as it was. It's a much smaller barracks now. It doesn't have the lands it would have had back then, but the buildings are still there. And it's if anybody's ever curious about visiting it, by all means, give me a shout and I'll give you a tour of it. So that's still there. Ballymullen Barracks, Tralee, and it was the regimental depot of the Royal Munster Fusiliers. So everything would have come through there. The regiment itself traditionally recruited from Cork, Limerick, Kerry, and Clare. So just to help you with the geography of it, if you can picture a map of Ireland, you're talking about the bottom left-hand corner as you look at it. So you're talking about Kerry being the bottom left-hand corner, county beside it is Cork, to the north of it is Clare, and to the just slightly to the right of that would be Limerick. So it's that bottom left-hand corner would be where the typical recruiting ground was. The first battalion, as you know, there was a battalion, generally speaking, a battalion at home and a battalion abroad. That was generally how it worked. So the first battalion, regular troops, Royal Munster Fusiliers, majority recruited from those areas that I've just mentioned. They were at Rangoon at the outbreak of the war, and they were called back home and stationed at home prior to their dispatch to Gallipoli, where they took part in the initial landings of the 25th of April, 1915. So these are the men that would have landed on the 25th of April as part of the attack on V Beach. They were pre-war regular troops, had been abroad for quite a long time, many of them. Many of them would have, served abroad for quite a while, wouldn't have been back in Ireland for a good few years. And it would have been the traditional well-trained, well-disciplined soldier of the day. So these are the men primarily that we're talking about at the start of the Gallipoli campaign. And the Royal Munster Fusiliers at Gallipoli were part of the 86th Brigade, 29th Division. So you the Hampshire Regiment, the Dublin Fusiliers would have been part of that as well. So that was the initial, I suppose, perspective of the Royal Munster Fusiliers. So why join the British Army? So Kerry had a long military tradition. Ballymullen Barracks, many units had rotated through there and continued to do so. And every time a unit was there for a period of time, many of the local men from the geographical area would have joined the British Army, joined that particular regiment that happened to be stationed there. West Kerry has had a long naval tradition. It was an interesting thing because West Kerry is by the sea, Dingle ports. The men there tended to join the navy, less so the army. And again, I would imagine that's to do with the fact that many of them would have got their living from the sea, and it would have been a natural fit, I suppose, with their own lifestyles. So, employment was a big issue. Ireland was economically depressed at stages, and Kerry, where we're talking about the Munster Fusiliers, that would have routinely featured on the congested district boards as a depressed area, and the average income would have been below what we would know today as the breadline. So many people in Kerry, parts of Limerick, certainly parts of Clare, rural parts of Cork, the recruiting ground for the Munster Fusiliers, many of the men in those areas would have been coming from fairly financially depressed areas. So the army was an enticing opportunity for them. So a lack of employment opportunities. The employment that was there tended to be on agriculture, so it was farming, it was labouring, it was quite seasonal. Um, it wasn't regular work. In the towns, there were some factories, so those people that had those jobs were probably all right, but there was a lot of poverty in towns as well. So the British Army for many, many years was an escape valve to, I suppose, permit and allow people obtain employment for themselves. Other things that the army offered a young man was food, clothing, shelter, and regular pay, which of course sounds very basic, but for some people that was a huge change. You know, the fact that you had a bed that you could call your own, you had your clothing, you had pay. That was an important thing as well, and it was regular. People could pick up bits of jobs here and there for periods of time, but there weren't any huge employers. Not like the north of Ireland where you had, say, Belfast in particular, Harland and Wolff, big employer, industrial employer. There wasn't that same level of industrialisation in the south of Ireland, and particularly in the area we're talking about here, where the Royal Munster Fusiliers were coming from. Again, very rural based, very agricultural based, and not much regular work to be had. An interesting point about the army, just to give you a sense, I suppose, of the people joining. The average recruit who joined the British Army within a month or 2 months, had gained a stone in weight. So when you consider people were probably much smaller than they are today back in those times, somebody joining the army with all the hard work that was involved and the running around and all of that, still managed to put on weight is telling you that they were obviously better fed, better nourished than they were getting outside of the army. There's also, of course, the notion of excitement and adventure. The uniform would have appealed. The chance to go into exotic places, Rangoon, that sounded very exotic. Egypt, Cairo, everywhere. It all sounded exciting. It was a better life than maybe the life that many of them are going to have. And these are the men that we're talking about. These are the men that were in the first battalion of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, who had come back from Rangoon and found themselves heading for Gallipoli. There was also a level of peer pressure as well. Your friends were joining, your neighbours were joining. Naturally enough, you would want to go as well. And this is a recruiting poster from the period, and it talks about the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and it says they're earning eternal fame, fighting for you. So there's an attempt here to localise this. Will the fine lads of Kerry, Cork, Limerick, and Clare do nothing to help their kinsmen come along and assist in destroying the German menace? So that was a recruiting poster directly at people from these geographical areas. And this one here, of course, you're very familiar with Kitchener and his finger. Kitchener was born in Kerry in a place called Ballylongford, which is about 25, 30 miles from here now, where I am from Tralee. So he was a Kerry man. He probably wouldn't admit to it, but he was. So again, there was a lot of play made on the fact that Kitchener is one of our own. We should really be joining the army for him as well. In terms of the army itself and the Royal Munster Fusiliers in particular, 500 reservists in Kerry were recalled to the colours. So that was the immediate impact on the local area. So the British Army, of course, had their base in Ballymullen Barracks, as I mentioned, but there were 500 reservists who had served in the army and had left it, but were still subject to recall, and they were recalled back to the colours. Some of them were thrilled, they were getting employment, they liked the army, they were glad to come back. For a lot of them, though, men in their 30s, 40s at this stage, probably married, settled down, probably had a job, had moved on from the life that the army had given them and the routine and the discipline and the rigidness of it. And many of them were quite annoyed or disappointed at having to give up the life that they now had and go back into the army, which was no different to many other towns throughout Britain, I would suspect. The bottom right-hand corner, the recruiting poster there is another interesting one. It's very heavy on nationalism and it's very heavy on patriotism, but it's also very heavy on religion. And this is one of the better known recruiting posters in Ireland at the time we're talking about. And you can see the harp there representing Ireland. The figure to the left is meant to represent Éire, the country Ireland. But if you look at it, it's a religious figure. It looks like the Blessed Virgin as well. So there's a play on religion there. And in the background, you can see the bugler calling the people to join. So this is a very potent poster, and it appeared all over the place. And no doubt many people were enticed by it. This notion that you're joining a crusade, you're joining something bigger than yourself, and it's a good thing to do, and it ties in with the strong Catholic religion ethos that would have been prevalent, I suppose, in the area that we're talking about. Another interesting enticement to join the army were the separation allowances. So this was money paid to dependents, wife and children. For many men, as I mentioned, the poverty line was never too far away. Work was infrequent, but now work was regular, and more importantly, I suppose, there was money going to be sent home to support family members. That was a big enticement. And yes, there was danger, and yes, you might not survive it. But for many people, they saw this was a huge boon and a huge advantage to what they had done previously. Uh, the army generally didn't pay that well. We all know this notion of a shilling a day is the pay of a private soldier, and yes, that's correct. But typically, they would top that up with marksmanship pay, or they would get other courses or other allowances. So typically, the pay was around about 1 and 9 pence. But that would be a fortune to many of the people that I'm talking about. The recruits that joined the British Army at the outbreak of the war and prior to the outbreak of the war, and who would have ended up in Gallipoli, the Dardanelles, they were mainly from towns, they were mainly unskilled or labourers who with infrequent incomes, and a lot of farmers, very, very few farmers or farmers' sons would have joined the army, and the reason for that is the agricultural sector. Where the Royal Munster Fusiliers had traditionally recruited from, began to boom. The army needed to be fed. So there was a huge premium in bacon prices, animals, feedstuffs, all of that. All those increased dramatically in price. So farmers did very, very well. Even when I was a young boy, I can remember stories of farmers would say that their grandfathers who would have lived through all of this, saying that the war had made them, that the war was their first opportunity to sell their goods to a market with the price continually rising, and that there was a regular source for their market. So the war was quite good for farmers, and as a result, not many farmers' sons or farmers would actually join the army, which wouldn't have been the case previously. The traditional soldiering, of course, continued, as I mentioned. Another thing as well, and this is quite relevant in the context of Gallipoli and what did change, I suppose, people's attitudes in Ireland towards the war. Many people would have this idea that the 1916 Rising or the 1916 Rebellion, as it might be referred to, was a lot of the reason Ireland turned against the war. The actual roots of that were actually much earlier, and a lot of it came from the failures of Gallipoli and the lack of success of that campaign. At the beginning of the war, John Redmond, this man on the top right-hand corner, he was the leader of the Home Rule Party, in Westminster. He had secured Home Rule for Ireland. I suppose the best way to describe that, it was referred to as similar to Dominion status, so a bit like Canada. Ireland would remain part of the British Empire, would have its own Parliament, would have a significant degree of control over its own finances, and that was generally accepted by most people as a great achievement. And they thought it was a good thing that Ireland would get its own could I suppose write its own destiny. John Redmond, of course, was the hero. This had been passed, but it was delayed for 2 years following the outbreak of the war. So there was a degree of disappointment with that. But John Redmond, at a place called Woodenbridge in Wicklow, gave a very famous speech, and he talked about how, after years of trying to, I suppose, remove itself from the British Empire, that they had now succeeded, and he encouraged people to join the British Army in their hour of need. He talked about this idea that we should help them. We're going to be part of the empire ourselves, not as a subjugated power, but as a partner. And he encouraged people to join, and a lot of people did. A lot of people joined because of that. They would have been supporters of John Redmond, and a lot of the people in it were a lot of the intelligentsia, the thinkers, if you like, the educated middle class. A lot of those would have responded to John Redmond because they would have trusted his judgment all along. And many of these people were the ones who found themselves in Gallipoli, not at the initial landings. They were pre-war regular troops, but certainly at Suvla Bay. And many of them would have found themselves there. The county of Kerry, where I'm from, where we're talking about, where the depot of the Munster Fusiliers Regiment is, 700 Kerrymen or thereabouts died during the war, and the figure is probably higher. Again, died all over the world, died in the Munster Fusiliers, but also died in many other regiments as well, and also served in other units and other armies. There was over 200 of these alone from Tralee, which was the depot of the Munster Fusiliers. Not just the British Army, again, just important to point out that Irishmen were joining other armies as well and were part of this. The Australian Army, there was 6,600 joined the Australian Army, Irishmen who joined the Australian Army, and these were referred to as six-bob tourists. So we've already seen that shilling and ninepence a day was typical pay for a British Army private. The Australian was getting 6 shillings a day, 3 times as much. For many of them, they saw it as an opportunity to get back to Ireland, and they became known as six bob tourists. The other interesting thing from the Australian perspective, and again, I won't dwell on it, but it's just to give a context, I suppose, to the Irish man joining different armies. A lot of the time, this was work. So, an Irishman joining the Australian army was guaranteed for at least a year. So there was a war after breaking out. He had an opportunity of work for a year. The pay was quite good, 6 shillings a day. There was also the chance to return to Ireland. And we must always remember this war was not meant to last too long. It'll be over by Christmas or it'll be over by the New Year. Again, an opportunity for people to join. There was 854 Irish Anzacs likely to have served in Gallipoli, and that's Jeff Kildea again has done that research on that, and very, very good book actually on the Irish in Gallipoli, the Anzacs. There were many other Irish, of course, serving in the British, Canadian, American, and other Allied forces. Not too sure about the Belgians or the French, probably not any, if many, if any at all, but certainly the British Army, Canadian, American immigrants who would have moved to those countries, Irish people serving there as well. And again, adventure, means of earning an income, were more likely drivers than patriotism or a sense of duty. So the Irish man that we're talking about had a different perspective. The John Redmond, the Home Rule Bill, Ireland remaining part of the British Empire, but going its own way was generally accepted as a good outcome for Ireland, and Ireland having control of its own destiny, its own finances, for example. They were the real drivers. It wasn't any loyalty to the empire in many cases that would have prompted people to join, with the exception of those from a unionist background or a Protestant background who would have obviously, that would have been very important to them. But the majority of Irishmen who joined, economics was the driver, money, chance for regular income, and I suppose the opportunity to have a life and a bit of excitement and adventure. This is an interesting photograph here. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Killarney. Killarney is a well-known tourist spot, was visited by Queen Victoria in the 1800s, and it became, after her visit, it became one of these go-to places that you should visit. And it became a real tourist hotspot, and still is today. And one of the key things to do if you ever get to Killarney is to take a trip on a jaunting car, which is a horse and trap around the lakes. And that's what these men are doing here. There's a Canadian, a couple of Canadians, there's an Australian, and there's a British Army soldier. And the likelihood is they're probably Irish, that they've come home to Ireland on leave. They're visiting Killarney, and they're taking a trip around the lakes. So just to make the point, I suppose that Irishmen joined many other units other than just the British Army. So now that we're getting back to the battle itself, we've given you a sense, I suppose, of the Irish connection with it and the Irish men that were involved. There was the pre-war regulars, the Munster Fusiliers, and obviously enough in the background there was recruiting to the other regiments and units that would fight there. So the plan, I suppose, to go back to that, the initial idea remained the desire to force the Dardanelles, the naval battle, but now the plan is to land troops, British and French troops, to secure the northern shore, capture the forts, as I mentioned, and the artillery batteries to clear the way for the Navy to proceed through the Narrows and the Sea of Marmara. So we've seen the Narrows, you've seen the photographs that I showed you earlier. On both sides of the peninsula, on that strip of water, there were troops going to be landed. The French were on the southern flank, the Allied troops on the northern flank. They were going to land, capture these forts, disable the artillery batteries, so that there was no further firing going to be put upon the minesweepers, who were going to go and clear the mines and allow the ships to carry on their way. There were six landing beaches: SVWXY at Helles and Anzac. Well, not, it wasn't called Anzac then, but it became known as Anzac Beach. And the French landed at Boulair, and that was a diversionary raid. And the troops involved were French, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, Nepalese, Newfoundland, Irish, and British troops. Uh, Historically, today, the average person would be very well aware of the Australian and the New Zealanders, the Anzacs. Both countries would revere Anzac Day, would see it as the birth of their nation as independent nations. The French, less so, less well remembered. Indian, less well remembered, similarly with the Nepalese and the Newfoundland troops. And British troops, when compared to other battles like Passchendaele, Ypres, the Somme, these are far better known in British society. The average man or woman in the street would be familiar with those, less so with those. And the same is true in Ireland. Gallipoli, once it's become a forgotten battle, but outside of a historian, not too many people in Ireland would be familiar with Gallipoli or the Dardanelles, but they would be familiar with the likes of the Somme and Passchendaele. Uh, the troops that were involved, as we've seen already, we had the pre-war regular troops, which in our case here, we're talking specifically about the Royal Munster Fusiliers. There was also, of course, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who would have recruited from the city of Dublin. So you had these regular troops, quite experienced, had been serving abroad for many years, were very used to good shots, trained all the time, were well equipped. And then you had the untried and partly trained troops, people who rushed to enlist very early and found themselves joining the army. And the Australians and New Zealanders, to a significant extent, would have fallen into this. Many of those were sent on ships to Cairo and hadn't even fired a rifle and finished their training there. So you had that whole conglomerate of and mix, I suppose, of troops, the well trained and the untried and tested. Another interesting thing, the regular troops, which included the Royal Munster Fusiliers, they were not meant to stay in Gallipoli for any length of time. They were just simply on loan to Ian Hamilton to comply with his orders to clear those batteries. And when he had that done, those troops were to be released and they were going to be sent elsewhere, and he would have to manage with the untried and partly trained troops. So there was again a lack of a full commitment to a land invasion. And again, this is predicated on the notion this is going to be a quick action. Troops will land, they'll clear the batteries, they'll disable the artillery, and the ships will go back to what the original plan was. And again, this is just to show you a map and show you the area. And having been there, I suppose the thing that struck me is how small it is in real terms, the areas that we're talking about. You're talking about maybe 10, 15 miles from top to bottom, relatively small piece of ground, 60,000 troops to defend it, 78,000 trying to attack it. So this is the area, and of course what we're interested in on the initial landing is on the southern tip on the 25th of April, the landings at Helles on the 25th of April. That's where the beaches were. And these were the objectives on day one: the Achibaba, the mountain, and Krithia, neither of which were ever taken. So that's I suppose, put that in the context. The Royal Munster Fusiliers themselves, pre-war regular troops, they came ashore laden with equipment. So there was two elements to this. So the River Clyde, which I'll talk about in a moment, the Munster Fusiliers came ashore from that. There were also troops that were rowing ashore, primarily the Dublin Fusiliers. So these were in open boats. They rowed ashore. And they just got out of their boats. So there was two methodologies of landing the troops. These troops would have had no experience of amphibious warfare, would have had no experience of landing from a ship to a hostile beach under enemy fire, wouldn't have had any great sense of what was involved. The tactics used would have been basic enough. The whole idea would have been to get off the ship, go ashore, and attack whatever objectives were there. And again, the presumption being that the resistance would be relatively light, that they would get ashore, and that there would be any huge issue with it, and they would just press on and go inland. The infantrymen, again, just to give a context of it, they each carried a rifle, ammunition, bayonet, water bottle, an entrenching tool like a little spade or a shovel, a haversack, and a pack containing over 30 kilograms of extra rations, water, and clothing. That was a significant amount of weight to carry in those conditions, in that heat, and getting out of a boat into the water. Individual food rations known as iron rations consisted of tin bully beef, corned beef, as we know it, hard biscuits, tea sugar, and beef cubes. So there was enough to keep you going for a couple of days, but that was really about it. Soldiers attached most of this kit to their webbing, which they wore over their uniforms. And I suppose an interesting comparison, a modern soldier today would carry much more weight because the flak jacket that you wear with the plates in it, and the helmet and the packs are much, much heavier. But of course, troops today are much better conditioned. They train for longer. Physical fitness is a big element of it. And the weapons, of course, and the equipment that they carry are much more effective. So I would take my hat off and, having, seen what these men attempted to do with the clothing and the equipment that they have. It was some achievement to even just get ashore and survive for a number of days based with that. But again, for the Royal Munster Fusiliers, pre-war regulars, they would have been very used to carrying this level and this weight of equipment. So I suppose put it into context, the figure on the right would have been how a Munster Fusilier, a Dublin Fusilier, would have arrived on Gallipoli on the day. His ammunition boots, his puttees, his rifle, his bayonet, and his pack, his heavy serge wool uniform, which of course, if it got wet, it made it even heavier. And there's the equipment that he would have worn. Again, cleverly put together. The webbing, it all fitted together, so it all fitted over his back, a little bit like putting on a waistcoat. And that type of style continued on for many, many years and would have continued on into the Second World War. So the equipment was reasonably well designed, but of course, it was the weight of it was the issue. By the time troops were landing at Suvla Bay the following year, they were dressed quite differently, much lighter equipment, and you can see them wearing shorts, khaki drill shorts, and the hat was much lighter as well and was made of cork, so it was much lighter. So again, there were improvements in equipment. But the Munster Fusiliers, the man on the right there, that's what he would have landed in, unsuited and unsuitable for the environment. The seven landings, as I mentioned earlier on, they were met with varying degrees of surprise and success. So many people would know that the landings at Anzac, they landed at the wrong beach, and yet many people would be aware of other landings that were quite successful. However, for the Munster Fusiliers, the first Munsters and the first Dublin Fusiliers, and two companies of the Hampshire Regiment, so they would have been the assaulting force. They assaulted V Beach, which again is at the bottom tip of the peninsula, beside the village of Sedel Bar on the very tip of the peninsula. So their objectives were there. They were to storm ashore, capture the village, and push on inland. There was a ship, a collier, coal ship called the River Clyde, and it was run aground on V Beach. So again, a lot of romance about the Gallipoli campaign, and this is another example of it here, the notion of landing a ship aground on V Beach. We saw it again in the Second World War in Campbell with the Campbelltown and the raid there. But there was a kind of a romance to this, and it was an audacious plan, running a ship ashore and the troops jumping out of it, a bit like the Trojan horse of Troy. There was a kind of a throwback to that. So again, you can see the attraction of this as a plan. Wide holes had been cut in the side of the ship, from which specially built gangways led to the ship's brow. So, in other words, the troops would come out the side of the ship, run onto these gangways, and straight onto the beach without getting their feet wet. Upon impact, half of the Munster Fusiliers came out both sides of the ship, and half of the Dublins emerged from each side of the collier, and they stormed the shore. Rowing boats landed the rest of the Dublin Fusiliers. So it was, as an operation, it had the advantage, or at least the intent, was to land a large number of troops at one point quite quickly. So it did achieve that in the sense that you had the troops on this ship. Ship was crashed onto the beach. The troops would get off relatively quickly, and the remaining troops were in rowboats. So it did have that advantage, and that was the intent, that the troops would arrive quickly and overpower the defences. But of course, as we know, that's not what happened. Speed and timing were essential. And again, no real rehearsals had taken place. I don't think you could have rehearsed something like that. You could have maybe rehearsed the rowing boats, but you certainly couldn't rehearse the notion of a ship crashing onto a beach and troops storming off it. That wouldn't have been possible. And again, the troops, pre-war regulars, confident in their own ability, experienced, used to obeying orders, would have been disciplined, would have probably behaved well under fire, would have had a lot of trust in their leadership, particularly the officers. So there was a lot of belief, I suppose, that all of that would see them through. And here's it's a graph, a picture, I suppose, of what was attempted. And there's the River Clyde, and you can see the troops uh, coming out the side of the ship. So roughly there in the center of the picture, you can see a gangplank down by the side. The troops running across it onto the boats, and then transshipping through the boats and onto the beach. Problem with it, as you can see straight away, is it's a very narrow little gangplank. Probably not enough room for more than one or two people to be on it. So, for the Turks, for the defenders' point of view, this wouldn't be hard to defend against. Um, you were probably only firing at that gangplank, and the numbers of troops who can survive that would have been relatively small. So, if the defenders were in any way well organized and well entrenched and well positioned, which they were, something like this was going to be hard to achieve successfully. And of course, the tragedy and the sadness of it was the numbers of troops that, despite it being clearly not a success, that continued to obey orders and continued to try and storm ashore. There's the River Clyde after the battle. You can see where it's ran aground. This is a view from a Turkish defensive position, and you can see where the bow of the ship, the front of it, has crashed onto the beach, and that's just how that looked. Some of the comments from the people that were on the ship, just to give you a sense of how they suffered. There was a Private R. Martin from the first Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he would have been involved in this. And he said, there were 25 in my boat, and there were only three of us left. It was sad to hear our poor chums moaning and to see others dead in the boat. It was a terrible sight to see the poor boys dead in the water and others on the beach roaring for help. Those who were lying wounded on the shore in the evening, the tide came in and they all drowned. I was left by myself on the beach. I had to remain in the water for about 3 hours, or they would fire on me as soon as they saw me make a move. So that was one man's experience. And another one that's an interesting character, and we have Guy Geddes from the first Royal Munster Fusiliers, pre-war regular. Um, I can't remember which part of Britain he was from, but he was a pre-war regular, had served the Munster Fusiliers for a good number of years. And he described the landing and he said, We got it like anything. Man after man behind me was shot down, but they never wavered. Lieutenant Watts, who was wounded in 5 places and was lying on the gangway, cheered the men on. I can think of no finer episode that could be found of the men's bravery and the discipline than of this, of leaving the safety of the River Clyde to go to what was practically certain death. Guy Geddes himself survived the war, became an alcoholic, uh, suffered dreadfully with nightmares, and on the anniversary of that battle, the 25th of April, he committed suicide. He shot himself about 10 years later. So this is a man who was traumatized, obviously, by the battle and never really put it behind him. These are a useful illustration of, I suppose, the Turkish field of fire. And I suppose from a military point of view, that's what you'll be looking at. What did the enemy see? What was it they actually were firing upon? So if we look at the top, we can see Sed El Bar Fort. That was the objective. Uh, the, there's a misspelling there. The Dardanelles Straits is the water. You can see the arrow pointing down, and that's showing us the approximate location of the River Clyde. That's where that ship would have come ashore. So a relatively short distance to go to Sed El Bar and the village beyond, if you weren't being fired upon. And what's interesting as well, then you can see the arrow showing us where V Beach Cemetery is, where a lot of the Munster Fusiliers and the Dublin Fusiliers are buried. That's important because that was one of the defensive positions. And I'll show you here now what I'm talking about. And you can see it here. So these are reconstructed trenches on V Beach, but you can see the field of fire that they had. So on the left-hand side of our screen there, we can see the village and we can see the fort of Sed El Bar, where we have the little piece of ground sticking out into the water. That's roughly where the River Clyde was. but you can see from here how clear and how easy it was for the Turkish defenders to rain fire down on the British soldiers, the Munster Fusiliers, Dublin Fusiliers, Hampshire Regiment. So that was the tragedy of it. And really, for those troops landing at that point, they had nowhere else to go other than inland through the beach and through the village, all the time being fired upon from above and to the side. So that was the real difficulty. And of course, the village itself was also a strong point. So I think that gives us a very good graphic illustration of of how difficult this was and how I suppose the planning of it hadn't probably foreseen to the extent necessary of what might actually occur. And here's an example again of there's the fort in front of us, Sedel Bar, and you can see the cutters of the little of the boats, and you can actually see men on them, the dead and dying on the boat who failed to make it ashore. And a sad thing, I suppose, was there were Irishmen on this boat who knew they were dying, who knew they weren't going to survive, and they wrote final notes to their families while lying on these tenders. And these letters were obviously stained with blood and transcribed later on and passed on to their families. So they're waiting their fate, knowing they weren't going to get off the boat, knowing they were still under enemy fire, knowing they couldn't be saved or rescued. They wrote farewell notes to their families. So again, that's quite poignant to think of. I suppose men that probably weren't too far from where I am now. Got as far as somewhere like Gallipoli, Fee Beach, and died on those boats. This is a picture taken. This is my own father there. And he's filling in for where the River Clyde pretty much stopped. And again, you can see the remnants of Sedel Bar just beyond. So I think that's what struck me with it when I was there, is how very near this could have been to being a spectacular success if the troops had got ashore quickly. I would wonder if it was done at night, you'd have the advantage of surprise, the advantage of darkness. You'd also have had more confusion. It would have been harder to keep troops together, but you certainly would have had fewer casualties. And it's probably one of the great imponderables, an audacious plan, but it turned out to be an absolute disaster, I suppose, in its execution. And again, I suppose the Turks defended well, but it was a relatively easy piece of ground to defend against for all the reasons I've outlined. The surviving troops, and I suppose that the miracle is as many survived as actually did. The surviving Dublin and Munster Fusiliers, there was originally 2,000 men. They were reduced to 770 within days, so effectively less than a battalion. Battalions during the First World War were much larger than battalions today, which are around about an infantry battalion today is about 450 troops. These were 1,000 plus, so they're much bigger. Platoons were much bigger as well, so it was the numbers were much higher. So the survivors were just redesignated as one battalion, and they were called the Dubsters, the Dublin Fusiliers and the Munster Fusiliers, the Dubsters. And neither side were too impressed with this. They would have had a great jealousy and rivalry, but they would also be very proud of their cap badges and their unique identity. And while it was only a temporary thing, neither side were very happy about it, but they did what they had to do. The next day, they began fighting their way inland to capture the village of Sed El Bar. So, having survived the nightmare of getting ashore, they now just had to push on with their day one objective. On April the 30th and the 1st of May, there was a fierce counter-attack from the Turks, and another 150 men were killed. I don't have figures for Turkish casualties, but they must have been quite high because, as I mentioned earlier on, the advantage is always with the defender when it comes to defending territory. Much of the fighting was hand to hand with bayonet, so quite vicious, quite close quarter. And again, I suppose from a Turkish perspective, they were defending their homeland as they saw it. From the Allied perspective, they were trying to achieve their objectives. And again, many more Irishmen would die in May, June, and July in the attempt to capture Krithia and Achibaba, which were first day objectives, as I showed on the previous slide, but were never actually taken. So again, many Irishmen serving in other regiments of the British Army, in addition, I suppose, to the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers, would continue to attempt, I suppose, to achieve these objectives. I suppose what went wrong and where the issues were, and I'm pretty much articulated them at this stage, but for the battle to be a success, particularly the River Clyde, it had to be accomplished quickly and with speed, and that was a difficulty. It couldn't be because the Turks were too well entrenched, too well dug in, and too well prepared. As soon as men began to dig trenches to shelter from Turkish fire, momentum was lost. It then became an extension of what was visible on the Western Front. As soon as you dig a trench, you're no longer mobile, you're static. And if the enemy does the same thing, then both of you are static. And that's effectively what happened in Gallipoli and the Dardanelles across all sectors of the front. The Turks, of course, were the defending side. It was their territory, so for them it was much easier to reinforce and resupply, whereas the Allies were bringing things all the way from Egypt and Malta, Valletta, and even as far afield as Britain. It had a much longer journey to travel. It had a much longer supply chain. It was much more difficult to maintain the momentum. Men were bogged down and conditions began to deteriorate. Trenches were often within yards of each other. And another issue as well that maybe isn't always articulated is there was no rest area. There was nowhere you could go. You couldn't get on a train and travel 30 miles and get away from it all. You couldn't go home for leave. You were stuck there. There was nowhere to go. You were on the Dardanelles, you were on Gallipoli. There was no rest area, and men became exhausted. The Turks could rotate units in and out as they needed. That wasn't available to the Allies. And even if you were out of the front line, where were you going to go? 2 miles back to a beach, which was being shelled. So that was a constant theme as well. Men were just constantly exhausted, never getting a chance, I suppose, to get a proper rest. Always under fire, always under danger. The terrain was something that wouldn't be that Europeans, I suppose, certainly Europeans from Ireland and Britain wouldn't be used to. It was harsh, the heat was unbearable, and of course the ever-present flies and everything else that was there. Here's an example of what the terrain looks like. Um, that's a photograph I took there a good number of years ago. And again, you can see how rough and undulating it is. If you're coming ashore here and you're trying to get to the top of this little spur, that's a tough climb. And to do it with all the equipment that you have to carry, and then to do it while being fired at, is next to impossible. The food and the living conditions, as I mentioned, the troops lived on a staple diet of bully beef and biscuits, referred to as Army Number 4 biscuits, and jam. Fresh fruit and vegetables were non-existent; they weren't available. And the food quality there, it was fine for a short period of time, but it had a very low vitamin content. So, for an extended period, this food wasn't really nutritious, or wasn't really, I suppose, giving people the calories that they needed to exist in those conditions. Drinking water wasn't available, so it had to be transported by ship, which again was another burden, I suppose, on the supply chain. There were attempts made to desalinate water, seawater. Again, that wasn't a success to any great extent. Sanitation was also a problem. With thousands of men in a cramped space, latrines were filling up fast, and there was limited space for new ones. So we had huge numbers of troops ashore in a relatively small area. They were never intended to stay in that small area. They were meant to push on through it and on to the next objective, and the troops behind them were going to reinforce and continue on and continue this onward progression, which of course didn't happen. Body lice became endemic. Everybody had it. Diseases like dysentery, diarrhea, enteric fever, typhoid, all of these would have flourished in the unsanitary conditions at a time when penicillin had still to be invented. Antibiotics were unheard of. They wouldn't come along for another 20 years. So people became unwell. A relatively minor illness that today we could treat quite easily could be a life killer in those conditions. Swarms of flies tormented the men. They were flying back and forth between the Turkish positions and the Allied positions. Obviously, all the bodies between no man's land, they were there as well. So it was just a breeding ground, I suppose, for illness and disease. Turkish snipers were everywhere, so moving about in daylight was quite difficult as well. One officer, Lieutenant Guy Nightingale for the Royal Munster Fusiliers, he had come ashore on the original landings, and he was entrenched. And he says, "I've never seen fellows getting old so quickly." This morning I saw a fellow called O'Hara in the Dublins, who I hadn't seen in a fortnight, and I barely recognised him. So the strain of the battle, the exhaustion, the lack of a good rest, so the lack of hygiene, clothing starting to deteriorate. In a fortnight, people began to, I suppose, age and to, to show the strain and the exhaustion of it all. For the wounded on Gallipoli, of which there were many, the wait for treatment and evacuation was often long and agonizing. So that was another consideration that hadn't really been fully thought out. This is going to be a quick battle. We will have casualties, but there won't be that many, so we don't need to put a lot of resources into it. But of course, that wasn't what actually happened. Illness was another concern that wasn't really considered. It was rampant on the peninsula. When you have a body of people closely confined to each other, and we'll remember this from COVID there a couple of years ago, how you had to keep your distance. None of that was possible in Gallipoli. So more men actually died from disease than actually bomb or bullet, which is an interesting statistic. Compared with the organization and the efficiency of the Western Front, where you had hospitals and a fairly sophisticated medical evacuation facilities, Gallipoli, it was a shambles. It was far from ideal. The sheer scale was the issue. It wasn't the professionalism of the people, or the medical care, or their skills, or their ability or willingness. It was nothing to do with that. It was just the sheer volume of people they were expected to deal with. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, there was no rear area. There was no hospital where you could take people other than Mudras, the island. But a majority of casualties ended up being moved by ship to Egypt and Malta. Again, tying up logistics, tying up the supply chain. And the wounded, of course, were not the priority. The priority, even today, in a battle today, the wounded are not the priority. The priority is in the objective, seizing the objective, completing the mission. Yes, the wounded are important, and you do your best for them, but it's not the priority. The priority will always be achieving the objective. And again, this is a famous picture of a Turkish soldier with an Australian officer, a wounded officer that he brought in and placed over in the Allied lines. You see this picture is actually from the Gallipoli Peninsula. But becoming wounded or ill in Gallipoli would have been a very serious thing. You would have required your own resilience to a large extent to survive all of this at a time when we've seen the diet was so poor, the calories weren't there, the nutrition wasn't there. It took a lot of resilience and hardiness from people to survive that. And quite a lot of people, who ordinarily might have survived, couldn't exist under those conditions and succumb to their illness or to their injuries. And here's an example, I suppose, of a communications trench. And you can see how difficult it is as a wounded man on a stretcher, two fellows trying to carry him, but look at what they're trying to traverse through. People, trying to get out of the way, but they have to get on with their business as well. So, being wounded, as I said, was a significant issue for people who were unfortunate enough to experience that. One officer, a Lieutenant J.I. O'Sullivan, John Ivor O'Sullivan, he's from Killarney, but he was a medical officer with the Connacht Rangers, which is a regiment up the road from the Munster Fusiliers. They would have been on the west of Ireland. And he said that he had at one time over 320 stretcher cases at his medical aid post. He was just one doctor, clearly overwhelming the paltry medical facilities available. So he was just basically saying he was completely and utterly overwhelmed. He was just trying to do the best he could with what he had. But again, 320 stretcher cases. That's not to mention the walking wounded, or those who were lightly wounded that he probably didn't even get to see. Stretcher cases were the seriously wounded people. So that's just to give you a sense, I suppose, from an Irish perspective of how unprepared it was for the casualty rates that were experienced. So that was the initial landing at the V Beach and W Beach and S Beach, varying degrees of success. Some were better than others, but the battle settled into a routine of trench warfare and all the things I've described there. Uh, so then the decision, Ian Hamilton had to decide, do I reinforce failure? In other words, do I put more troops into this area, or do I try something different? And of course, he tried something new. There was a second attempt at landing troops further up the coast, which again was audacious. It was risky, of course, but it was creative thinking on his side, and I suppose that was the intent was, well, we haven't succeeded here, but we have tied up a lot of the Turks in this area. So if we outflank them, we might be able to push through with our objectives. So you must remember at all times, go back, a few months earlier, when the belief was that a couple of warships will sail through here and arrive off Constantinople. We now are at a situation where there's tens of thousands of troops on both sides committed to a trench-like scenario, and the objectives still haven't been achieved. As the weeks turned to months, the 10th Irish Division was sent along with other reinforcements to try and force the impasse. Again, regular troops. Uh, the 10th Irish Division was formed in 1914, and these are the people I referred to earlier. A lot of these men would have joined um, at the prompting of John Redmond, would have been seen as cementing home rule, would have been seen as we're helping the empire in its hour of need. This is going to be in our favour when it comes to home rule. We can still be part of the British Empire, but have our own identity. So many of these were volunteers. Many of them would have been well educated. The intelligentsia, the political thinkers, the leaders, many of them were in this. So it would be correct to say that a lot of the flower of Irish manhood and the future leaders of the country died in the Somme. That wouldn't necessarily be the case. A lot of them would have died in Gallipoli, and these are the people I'm talking about now. So the 10th Irish Division was formed in 1914, and many of these were the volunteers I mentioned. So they contained a lot of middle class Irish, both Catholic and Protestant, and a lot of these people, were quite happy to work together. They were reflecting the Home Rule Bill and a shared future. So while they might have had different political viewpoints, they were still seeing themselves as Irish. Still seeing themselves as being part of the British Empire, still seeing themselves as contributing to that. And they saw this as probably a vision of what the Home Rule Bill could produce, a shared island, a shared future. Uh, of course, in all of that, you also had those who were lured by excitement or necessity. The economic factors were drivers as well. But you also had people who just went for the excitement of it all. So these are the people who joined the army at the very outbreak of the war for all of these reasons. We're here to support the Home Rule Bill. We're here to show we're part of the empire. We're here because we want excitement. We're here because it's a well-paying job and it's a regular income. All of that would have formed the 10th Irish Division. So, from Ian Hamilton's point of view, he having failed at Hellas, the five beaches as I mentioned, a fresh attempt was launched further north at Suvla Bay in August. And again, going back to my own childhood, older men would have talked about Suvla Bay. It would have been a thing they would have mentioned. Probably wouldn't have meant much to me at the time, but they would have talked about it. Anybody who joined the army after the war had started would have probably found themselves at Suvla Bay if they had fought in Gallipoli, and it became a kind of a moniker, I suppose, for hardship and misery and all that went with it. However, I suppose from Hamilton's point of view, there was general optimism that this latter battle would be a success, and the landings began on the 7th of August. So the morale was still quite high. The initial landings had to achieve what they intended to achieve. The naval bombardment, the naval assault had also not been a success. But lessons had been learned, and again, I suppose the belief was 4 months later, we'll have a success here at Suvla Bay. So back to my map again. We had the initial landings at the southern tip. We showed you the impact on the Munster Fusiliers. So now more Irishmen in the 10th Irish Division, and I'm not diminishing the involvement of all the other units. I suppose I'm just focusing on the Irish contribution. So they came ashore at Suvla Bay up here, which would become quite well known afterwards on the 7th of August. And here it is today, and it's a fairly natural bay. I can remember looking at it as well from a height, from a Turkish position when I went to Gallipoli, and I remember thinking how difficult it would be to defend all of it, given the terrain, in terms of the volume of troops you would need. That for the attacker, if they managed to get ashore at all and establish quickly, they could move in quickly because it would be very difficult to reinforce and defend the whole area in any kind of strength. So the landings this time were a success. The beaches were undefended and the troops got ashore, so that was a big start. And then this is where it started to unravel. Having got ashore, that's the easy part. You then have to move ashore as quickly as you possibly can and seize the high ground because that's what's going to determine the outcome of the battle. This is what they hadn't achieved at the earlier landings. This is what they now needed to achieve on these landings. But of course, that General Stopford, who was the officer commanding this, he displayed command ineptitude. Wasn't This was a modern war. He wouldn't have had the experience to deal with this. He had got ashore. He thought that was the achievement, when in fact that was the beginning of the achievement. There was no clear tactical plan. Ian Hamilton kind of left it up to the local commander on the spot, which was Stopford. Didn't really interfere, which of course was a mistake in hindsight. Poor communications. So Hamilton was on his ship miles away, trying to communicate ashore. No clear direction, no clear orders. So instead of pushing inland and seizing the high ground, no orders were issued. So as anybody who's ever served in the military is, if you don't tell soldiers to do something, they'll do exactly that. They'll do exactly what you told them to do, which is nothing, and they'll just sit around and wait. And that's what happened here. So without any orders, the troops just sat down and waited. So they went swimming, they relaxed, and they were waiting to be told what to do. The Turks on the other side had been taken by surprise, hadn't expected these landings, didn't think the Allies had troops to commit to another series of landings. But Ataturk, he displayed his own leadership by rushing troops to the area from the north. He himself seized the high ground and also the initiative. So instead of the Allies pushing in the 6 miles and taking the high ground and holding it, the Turks actually did. And as a result, then, the future of that battle was probably not in doubt. Whoever held the high ground was going to dominate the territory, was going to control the outcome. And over the following weeks, the 10th Irish Division, along with many others, suffered particularly heavy casualties. Uh, During their assault to capture Kiritek Tepe Ridge of 600 feet high, not very small, but it was several miles long, and there were a number of attempts to capture this. Again, these were amateur people, not professional soldiers. Many of them, as I said, the officers in particular, coming from the intelligentsia of Ireland, the middle class, the future leaders of the country, seeing this as the great adventure, seeing this as the birth of their Irishness as part of being part within the British Empire, and obviously trying to do their very best, but unfortunately failing. So again, this then stagnated into another campaign of trench warfare. And again, you can see an example of the terrain here, open, very little cover. It's difficult to entrench. You can dig into this, and the Turks are at the top, firing down at attackers. Even today, soldiers today would struggle to try and deal with something like this. So the defender had all the advantages, quite apart from the fact that it was their homeland. The terrain and the high ground dominated everything, and the roughness of the terrain made it hard to go up and attack. I suppose as the months rolled on into the winter, it was increasingly obvious that the venture had been a costly failure. So the initial objective to force the Straits using ships hadn't succeeded. The initial landings had been a costly failure and stagnated into trench warfare. And then the third attempt, which was the landings at Suvla, again hadn't been a success. So it was obvious that it hadn't succeeded. Newspaper articles openly criticised the campaign, and that happened in Ireland as well. Troops were writing home. They were writing home about what had happened. No, they might have been limited in scope to their own particular area. They may not have had the strategic overview of it all, but since the battlefield was relatively small, it didn't take much to realise we've been here for months and we're not going anywhere. So this isn't the plan that we had initially thought it was going to be. Lord Kitchener, our friend from the start, the recruiting poster, born in Ballylongford in County Kerry, he was sent to Gallipoli to evaluate. He quickly realised it was futile. He looked at what had been achieved versus the objectives. And if you remember, at the start of my presentation, I outlined the three key taskings, and the key objective was to go to Istanbul, and that was 150 miles away, and there were no near getting there. So he quickly realised that this is not going to be a success. And it was said of him afterwards, a bit unfairly. He came, he saw, he capitulated, which I thought was quite unfair. He came, he saw, and he saw reality, and he made a decision that this venture had to be brought to an end. There was a rainstorm on the 26th of November. Remember, the troops had landed in hot, very warm weather. Weren't really prepared to be expecting to be there for too long, so there wasn't a lot of warm clothing. This storm lasted for 3 days and just heaped further misery on people who'd been there for maybe 6 months at this stage, or longer, and weren't prepared for the winter weather. Men didn't have winter clothing. There was a blizzard at Suvla in early December. That would have been unthinkable back in August when the troops went ashore and were swimming there and prepared, expecting to be moving on. And now, within a couple of months, they're now dealing with winter conditions. So rain flooded trenches and the soldiers were drowned. So all the miseries of life were being thrown at these poor devils. And the snow killed more men from exposure. So you had all of these things to contend with as well. The evacuation itself, I suppose, ironically, was probably the most successful part of the operation, and it was completed by the end of January. There was various ruses to convince the Turks that the trenches were still manned. You've all seen pictures like this for the self-firing rifle. Troops were disembarked in phases, and pretty much everybody was withdrawn. Stores were destroyed, horses were destroyed. There was a huge loss of equipment, horses and supplies, and I suppose a huge loss of face as well. And it must have been particularly difficult for the men from the Munster Fusiliers and elsewhere who'd come ashore full of enthusiasm, had seen the experience going on, hadn't been a success, and then they had to withdraw, leaving their dead comrades behind. And I suppose a sense of failure. There would have been a sense of shame with that as well, no doubt. And all of that must have been difficult to bear. Um, it's also, of course, something that hasn't really been examined to any huge extent, but it's also possible that the Turks were possibly aware of what was going on, but saw little point in attacking. If your enemy is retreating or withdrawing, do you really want to commit troops into a battle and suffer casualties yourself if they're just going to go away of their own volition? So that's a consideration as well. I don't know if there are any science behind that, but just my own thinking, it's entirely possible that they were aware that there was some kind of a withdrawal and they just decided to let them go. At the end of the day, the Turks' objective was to defend the ground and seize it back from the Allies. If the Allies were leaving, they had achieved their objectives. There wasn't much point in attacking beyond that. Major Brian Cooper, one of the second in command, he was in the 5th Battalion, the Connacht Rangers, and he wrote, as an Irishman, he wrote about the impact, I suppose, of the withdrawal. And he said, we had passed this way less than 2 months before. This is part of the Suvla Bay landings. But we were going in the opposite direction, full of high hopes. Now we are leaving the peninsula, our work unfinished, and the Turks still in possession of the Narrows. Nor was it possible to help thinking of the friends lying in narrow graves on the scrub-covered hillside, or covered by the debris of filled-in trenches, whom we seemed to be abandoning. Yet there was sorrow at the parting, there was no despondency. So he was, I suppose, trying to put a brave face on it. But at the end of the day, he said it there. He was basically saying, we didn't succeed. We're leaving our friends behind. We're leaving. It hasn't been a successful venture. From an Irish perspective, back home in Ireland, obviously Gallipoli in 1915, it was a long way away from Dublin or Cork or Kerry or anywhere. So it did take some time for the casualty list to make their way back to Ireland and the dreaded telegrams to the families of those killed or wounded. And the number of Irish casualties caused a huge shock. Ireland hadn't really contributed troops to a pitched battle at this stage of the war. The people had joined up in 1914. The pre-war regulars, which are also Munster Fusiliers, would have suffered heavily at Mons, and there would have been casualties on the Western Front. But the men who fought in Gallipoli were the pre-war regulars and the Munster Fusiliers, but the ones that probably created the most shock were those who joined in late 1914 and who were sent to Gallipoli primarily to fight in Suvla Bay in the 10th Irish Division. And it was these people, these were their neighbours, their friends, these were people who weren't career military people. Many of them would have come from middle class Ireland, and it was these people that created the shock and started this whole anti-war antithesis that began in Ireland, and recruiting levels began to dip immediately thereafter. John Dillon, an Irish nationalist member of Parliament, and he wasn't alone. There were numbers of others who would have said similar things. He referred in the House of Commons to British officers leading Irishmen, and he described them. He said they who had led our regiments at Suvla and who had hurled them to death on the slopes of those hills which they would have carried and which would have been enabled them to get to Constantinople if they had been decently led. So he's attempting here to throw the entire blame at the leadership and obviously the fact that these are Irishmen, but they were led by British officers, so that's where the fault lay, is what he's saying there. There would have been a certain amount of populism in what he was saying, but many people would have believed it, and that would have been a theme. If you study the newspapers of the time, there would have been this constant theme about the poor Irishmen being kind of misled and being badly led and resulting in the tragedies there. But I think it was the personalities and the people that died, particularly at Suvla, that shocked a lot of Irish people. It brought the war very much home to them. And this was the beginning, if you like, of the move, I suppose, that made the war less than popular. Not as many people would suspect. The Somme the following year, yes, that had a huge impact as well. But it was the Gallipoli campaign. The best and brightest, somebody might say, or those who suffered and died at Gallipoli. Many of the moderate nationalists, the ones who weren't prepared to take up arms against the British Empire, were the ones who joined at the outbreak of the war and were killed. Gallipoli began the disillusionment of many in Ireland with the war. Still, you still had recruitments, people still joined, but not to the same extent. And I think that's an important point. And that's quite lost here in Ireland, I think. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily equate Gallipoli with the I suppose with the moderate nationalists, but it was quite prevalent. The 1916 Rising, the following year, compulsory and the conscription bill ultimately ended nationalist recruits to the British Army. So to explain what that is, the 1916 Rising, the 1916 Rebellion, you'd be familiar with, took place in Easter of 1916. Compulsory tillage. You heard me say earlier on in the presentation how farmers were doing very well out of the war. The ones who were doing the best of all were those who dealt with animals, cattle, horses, sheep, pigs. Not as much work with those, but as the war went on and the U-boats were sinking the convoys, compulsory tillage was introduced to Ireland, which meant that a portion of their farm had to be handed over to tillage crops, wheat and the like, which was a lot more labour intensive and a lot less profitable. And a lot of the farming community, railed against this and didn't want any part of it. So that, again, stopped people joining the British Army, and again, it probably turned people against the British establishment. And of course, the final thing was a conscription bill. 1918, the attempt to conscript within Ireland, conscripting people who didn't want to join the army anyway, but were maybe at this stage were anti the war and had probably got pro-nationalist tendencies. Again, all of these things conspired, I suppose, to end nationalist recruits to the British Army. But all of that started with the loss of men from an Irish background, the intelligentsia, if you like, who died on the beaches and on the hills around Suvla Bay. I see Stephen Thompson is on the call tonight, so hello, Stephen. And this is a relative of Stephen's, just to humanise it a little bit. This man is Second Lieutenant Henry Bruce Levi from Skibbereen. He was a member of A Company, 6th Royal Irish Rifles, member of the 29th Infantry Brigade, 10th Irish Division, a volunteer, one of the men I'm describing. He was killed in action on the 10th of August 1915, aged 19, at Sarrybar, Rhododendron Ridge. And his family, his large canvas pack was returned as part of his webbing, and Stephen has this, and he's shared it with me and allowed me to see it. But I suppose this is an attempt, if you like, to remind people of the human cost of this. This is somebody who has a direct link with a family member. So I suppose to look back on it, and we've covered a lot of ground, and it's been very Irish focused, and it's been Royal Munster Fusilier focused as well. And I suppose to just bring it back to what actually went wrong, why did it happen? I suppose looking at it objectively, and everybody's a genius after the event, but The plan for the naval assault was overly ambitious. That's quite obvious. You know, it was never going to succeed in of itself. Not committing troops at the start was a major contributing factor. There was never enough military resources provided throughout, and there was always a shortage of artillery, so it was always difficult for the Allies, I suppose, to force the issue. Once you had committed to a land campaign, then the delay in providing reinforcements was a further significant feature. Allied commanders themselves were of a limited quality. They were out of their depth in a modern war with insufficient and out-of-date senior command and battle experience. A modern war of this nature, of this scale, an industrial war they hadn't seen. They were empire builders. They had fought smaller wars, smaller skirmishes. They hadn't dealt with something of this nature. And the terrain, as I mentioned, difficult, not fully understood, and hard to navigate. So I suppose from an Irish perspective, just to wrap it up, I suppose the Turks themselves were prepared to die for their homeland. In addition to the battle casualties from bomb and bullet, there was a huge number of medical casualties. Um, Allied intelligence themselves was quite limited due to lack of sources. Where were they going to get their information from? And they also struggled to maintain the secrecy of their own operations and planning. Turkish spies were seeing ships coming and going from Cairo. They saw troops getting off them. It wasn't difficult to figure out where these troops were headed to. The Allies did manage to surprise the Turks on a number of occasions, but they failed repeatedly to press home the advantage of that surprise. And I think that's the real tragedy, that when they did actually make gains, they failed to exploit them. The political will to support the campaign gradually dissipated in favour of resolving the war on the Western Front. So you had this battle amongst politicians of the Easterners and the Westerners, and as we saw, the war was decided on the Western Front. And interestingly, Gallipoli has been studied and continues to be studied. It was used to prepare for the Normandy landings and indeed the Falkland Island landings, and is still taught today as a campaign to military strategists. I suppose the legacy of it, it was a stunning Turkish victory, celebrated today. If you go to Turkey, Ataturk is everywhere. If Erdogan hasn't pushed him aside, but he's still, it's a stunning Turkish victory. Made the reputation of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, seen as the officer who saved the country. Uh, he said at one stage, "I don't order you to fight, I order you to die." Uh, you can say that to people defending their home. You can't say that to people attacking a beach. And I think that was the difference. It was easier to motivate his troops, more so than the Allied troops. He went on to become the first president, founded modern Turkey, transformed Turkish society, adopted the alphabet, Western codes of dress, and he showed he had a sense of humor. Anybody who's been to Turkey knows that the salt is in the pepper and the pepper is in the salt. And that's known as Ataturk's revenge, people would say. So I suppose from an Irish perspective, just to finish it off, 3,000 Irishmen died at Gallipoli. That's a lot of people. The average man or woman in the street in Ireland wouldn't be aware of it, wouldn't have the consciousness of it. There was 8,700 Australians died, and look at how it's remembered there, seen as the awakening of national pride, seen as the birth of that nation. Similarly, with the New Zealanders, 2,700, more Irishmen died than New Zealanders. But look how much Anzac Day is celebrated in New Zealand. Gallipoli, as I've outlined, began to turn Irish public opinion against the war. The middle and the working classes witnessed sizable casualties, which had the effect of beginning this turn away from supporting the war. And the Irish contribution to it, as I said, is largely forgotten. And why? Because events overtook it. There's a song called The Foggy Dew, written in 1916, and it talks about the Irish rebellion and the Irish rising. And it's still, it's still a popular song. You still hear it sung. And one of the lines in it, it says, "It was better to die beneath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sed El Bar." And it was just reminding people that that war, is not relevant to us. We have our own fight at home. And I suppose to finish, I'll leave the last word to Ataturk. Probably one of the most beautiful memorials I've ever seen, because it tries to reconcile, I suppose. And Ataturk in 1934, he said at Anzac Cove, "You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. Having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to log in this evening and listen to this. I hope I've given you a perspective of Gallipoli that you may not have been aware of from an Irish perspective, from maybe a Southern Irish perspective, that the war in Gallipoli, the battles in Gallipoli, had a significant impact on subsequent events in Ireland and was one of the contributors, one of the key contributors that I suppose turned Irish people in a different direction and away from supporting the First World War.